Good morning. I hope everyone had a productive weekend. Krista Waldron is the seminar coordinator who will introduce our speaker today. Krista?
Good morning. I hope you all had a productive writing weekend and managed to get some rest also. This morning's talk is by David Engerman, the Leitner International Interdisciplinary Professor of History. His specialty is 20th century international history. This is his first experience leading a seminar, and he was pleasantly surprised that one of his high school classmates is a National Fellow from Philadelphia. Our seminar title is American History Through American Lives, and the title of his talk this morning is Living History, Exploring the American Past Through Biography. Please post questions in chat, and I will field those to David at the end of his talk.
Great, well, thanks. I'm thrilled to be here, whatever here actually means in our virtual world. And to be honest, I'm actually kind of tired of being here in my study where I've been recording lectures all spring and so on. But I'm really thrilled to be part of the National Initiative, and I'm especially grateful to those who have initiated me into its traditions and practices, Jim Vivian, Stephanie Reed, and especially actually Krista Waldron in particular. As Krista said, I'm doing a seminar on American history through American lives. I wanted to share a little bit about themes that we're addressing here. It's not a full-scale review of the seminar day by day, but a chance to see some of what we're exploring. There are lots of ways of telling American history through American lives, but the seminar topics here were designed and selected to reflect the teacher's interests, broadly speaking. The curriculum units, I should note, were well underway, of course, long before George Floyd's murder, but in a lot of ways aren't too removed from our own moment. So if the slideshow is working properly, I should be able to get started here. I want to start with a quotation from the first paragraph of the first reading that we did last Monday, which is from a classic advertising campaign for Teachers Scotch from the 1940s and 50s. These ads tell us a lot about the 1950s. Apparently, what men were supposed to do was bowl and play bridge and golf. But they also, and more importantly, of course, frame the discussion that we opened with about individual experience and the relationship between individual experience and historical interpretation. The question came up in the form of a provocative, I think some of the seminar participants would say tendentious, article that we read by Paul Fussell. Fussell was a distinguished literature professor at the University of Pennsylvania for many years, was, as the middle photo shows, infantryman during World War II. And the essay that we read was the title essay of a book, collected book called Thank God for the Atom Bomb. Fussell is writing this essay in the early 1980s after a wave of historians have been criticizing the decision of President Harry Truman to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the last stages of the war against Japan in August 1945. Fussell argues that the critics had the luxury, I'd say, of making the argument they did because they didn't face the prospect of actually being part of the invasion force of Japan's home islands. Fussell himself had fought with his unit against Nazis in Europe, and they had actually transferred to the West Coast and were preparing to ship out for the invasion of the home islands against Japan. And he has little room to make an allowance those who weren't on the front lines. He uses the line from those Scotch ads, "Experience is the best teacher," to highlight the way his experience offers him, he believes, a kind of special historical insight. It's no one who was, anyone, he says, who wasn't destined for the invasion of Japan could dare to criticize the bomb. And he takes a number of swipes at people who were too young to be involved or who were not close enough to the front lines to have an informed position about this. So Fussell invites, I think, whether he likes it or not, a question about how we think about individual experience and larger historical processes like wars, social movements, and the like. Fussell invokes his experience to shut down other interpretations. But the premise of this seminar is actually that individual experiences don't shut down historical interpretation, but in fact, open up a range of historical interpretations. So in what follows here, I'm going to look at a few ways to that we're looking at biography in relation to American history. First, and I'll spend the longest time on this, is looking at how to understand the civil rights movement as a historical problem and a historical process. We'll also talk about, in a number of different ways, and this is what's coming up for our seminar this week, consider who gets to represent or own the experiences and the retellings of them, whether they're former slaves interviewed in the 1930s, Native American spiritual leaders, or feminist pioneers. So let me start with the civil rights movement. Again, this will be the bulk of what I talk about here today, and start out with it as a problem of historical interpretation, and then suggest what biography can do to help address it. The civil rights movement is traditionally defined as starting with the Brown v. Board decision in 1954, when the Supreme Court ruled that school desegregation had to end. It's separate, as the court ruled unanimously, was inherently unequal. What followed is a rising tide of Black protest in the South, according to this view, from the Montgomery bus boycott, Little Rock High School, student sit-ins, the famous March on Washington in 1963, to culminating ultimately in legislative achievements in 1964 and 1965. The Civil Rights Act, which outlawed discrimination by governments in public accommodations, and the Voting Rights Act, which promised the unimpeded right to vote for those who had been disenfranchised. And by any account, it's a stunning view of rapid change, undoing, the story goes, centuries of white supremacy in one eventful decade. It's a story that's replete with heroes at the sit-ins, the boycotts. It's replete with victims like Emmett Till, the boy who was killed, murdered in Mississippi. 1954, and perhaps more perpetrators than many Americans would care to admit. I won't dignify them with a rogues gallery here. But what implications can we draw from the narrative that's drawn out here, going from 1954 to 1965? One of the common implications is that the struggle began and ended within the traditional power structure. To put it bluntly, the movement started when 9 white guys with black robes in 1954 ruled about school desegregation, and it ends, as shown here, with President Johnson promising to enforce the idea that African Americans could vote. Secondly, it puts the impetus, the movement, in the hands of government forces. Secondly, it tends to define the problem that civil rights was trying to challenge, the movement was trying to challenge. It defines it as legalized and institutionalized white supremacy in the South, a problem that was solved with federal power, and then, the story goes, civil rights were achieved. Right? It also features high politics. So instead of starting with an ending with the Supreme Court and the president, Martin Luther King, of course, is ubiquitous at this time. And of course, so it features him in this sort of high politics that have seen the topmost reaches of the civil rights movement. Now, his role, of course, cannot be discounted, and I have no interest in suggesting otherwise, but we can't collapse the movement into his actions and his leadership. The movement was more disputed and internally divided, at times disputatious. Importantly, it was hardly seen as heroic and civil in its own time. Self-declared allies constantly were after King to slow down, to stop. They said, we're with you in general, but not this one particular move. His enemies, in fact, did try to stop him, threatened, or in fact, using physical violence to, of course, his assassination in 1968. And the enemies within government tried to break up the civil rights movement as well as King's own marriage, right? In addition, so one issue about this sort of standard view of the civil rights movement is not just does it center on King, but it comes to focus, I'd say, on only one Martin Luther King Jr. His brilliant "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington in 1963 was reread to suggest that his ultimate goal was colorblindness, that his ideas and his soaring language were, in this case, deployed for purposes, in fact, would have and indeed did challenge over his too short life. So we can see here some of the ways that his legacy is being kind of mobilized or for other purposes. A book here published in 1990 called Content of Our Character is an example of a push for colorblind conservatism. It's a book by an African conservative who uses King's phrase, where in that in that speech, he says he dreams of a day when his children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. But then the book goes on to suggest that therefore we should never be considering race as we shape policy. Perhaps even more striking is a Restoring Honor rally held in 2010. It's a conservative festival that selected, in fact, the anniversary weekend of the March on Washington in 1963. Sarah Palin was there to invoke Martin Luther King's courage and suggested that this was this sort of courage that conservatives needed to use now. Glenn Beck, one of the organizers, intentionally booked a room actually in the same hotel that MLK had stayed in during this, wore a bulletproof vest because if he was the leader of this, King, in fact, of course, had been assassinated. All right, and in an effort to sort of rewrite the civil rights movement for the purposes of what here we're calling colorblind conservatism. So not all of these results, not all of these interpretations result from looking at the civil rights movement as only taking place from 1954 to 1965, but instead I'd like to think of how it would change if we looked at that period in a broader context. And in our seminar, we did this by looking at the remarkable life of Bayard Rustin, who was the organizer, in fact, behind the scenes, for the most part, organizer of the March on Washington, and one of King's closest advisors in the late 1950s and in 1960s. And here, this picture in the top right is actually kind of an unusual one because Rustin performed mostly, did much of his work on the sidelines, not at center stage, not in the podium, right? Rustin in 1964, just after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, penned a stunning essay here called From Protest to Politics. And he wrote of this classical phase of the civil rights movement going from 1954 up until his moment, 64, and in which he acknowledged, although quite briefly, the heroism and sacrifice it took to get to that point. But then he turns a little more somber. Rustin says, we must recognize that in desegregating public accommodations, we affected institutions which are relatively peripheral both to the American socioeconomic order and to the fundamental conditions of life, of the Negro, this is his word, Negro people. In other words, the changes that had been affected through 1964 and 1965 were the most visible, but in fact, they were the easy part. He goes on to say that more African Americans were unemployed in 1964 than had been in 1954, that the racial gap in employment was growing, an income gap was also growing. He said more African American students were in de facto segregated schools in 1964 than they were when Brown v. Board decision came down in 1954. In other words, the achievements of the classical phase, however dramatic they were, according to Rustin, and however much sacrifice they entailed, only provided the basis for more fundamental change. Civil rights in this framing is part of a larger Black freedom struggle that had at its core not just the end of government-sanctioned discrimination, not just the right to vote, but the deployment of that political power to change the material conditions of Black America. And indeed, Rustin even worried that the civil rights movement itself had been misnamed, that civil rights was just the means for a broader freedom struggle, right? Civil political rights, and they were not the end of the effort, but they were just the means for a broader struggle. Which brings us to the phrase that historians have been examining for a couple of decades now, the so-called long civil rights movement, a term brought into historians' usage in 2004 after a really quite remarkable essay that we read in the seminar by UNC Chapel Hill historian Jacqueline Dowd Hall. This new civil rights, this long civil rights movement looks back longer. And in doing this, it's easy to joke, as I often do, that historians have a professional duty when we're among others to say that no matter what the question was, that it started earlier and it's more complicated. No matter what you're talking about, historians will always say it started earlier and it's more complicated. But my point here is actually not to compliment, not to complicate, but in fact to clarify, not to correct the date of when the civil rights movement started, but to change the entire narrative So to look at, and this is what Professor Hall invited us to do, look at a new timeline for a civil rights movement, not just 1954 to 65, but one that started much earlier and continued after 1965. This longer look makes everything I'd suggest look different. It's not just about adding events, but actually changing the content. For one thing, it puts Black activism at the center of the narrative, not the white response. So Brown v. Board in the Supreme Court decision becomes not the starting point for a new civil rights movement, but in fact, the successful result of a 20-year strategy led by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, founded in 1940 by Thurgood Marshall, a decades-long process to build the legal precedents that allowed Brown v. Board to be to come to a successful result. To look at this longer also puts economic concerns at the center, puts voting as a tool to win economic rights. First March for Jobs and Freedom was scheduled for 1941, led by the great union leader A. Philip Randolph. He canceled it at the last minute after he actually got a commitment from President Roosevelt, that Roosevelt would issue an executive order to desegregate the defense industries that were under defense contractors who were working for the federal government. So this long civil rights movement puts Black activism at the center, it puts economic concern at the center, and it also makes the struggle not just a Southern, but a national struggle. It's not just against the crushing particularities of the Jim Crow South, of white supremacy there, but against forms of discrimination that limited where African Americans could live and work, not just where they could shop and drink coffee. It precluded that these forms of discrimination precluded their benefiting from federal programs like the New Deal and the GI Bill that provided the basis of upward mobility for many, if not most, whites in these decades. And it defines the problem as an economic problem, not just a political one. And as it does this, these issues, these forms of discrimination, economic discrimination, housing, jobs, et cetera, were present in the urban North and in the West, as well as in the South. It makes this a national problem. So this narrative does, of course, keep Martin Luther King Jr. as a hero, not necessarily for starting a movement, as is sometimes suggested by narrowing too much on him, but for carrying it stirringly and effectively in new directions. Finally, this longer stretch of things actually makes MLK look different as well. He's interested in economic justice as well as ending discrimination. His ageless 1963 speech, I Have a Dream, was, after all, not just a march for civil rights, but a march for jobs and freedom. An intentional echo of the 1941 march planned by A. Philip Randolph. King, of course, was murdered in Memphis, assassinated when he'd gone to Memphis in April 1968 to cheer on a strike of Black sanitation workers. Right, King himself is pursuing economic rights as well as civil rights. The movement, also thinking that the movement didn't end in 1964 or 1965 with federal legislation, but we could see how it pursues new directions in pursuit of economic rights after 1965. The Poor People's Campaign, the Memphis strike, trying to make good on legislative and judicial victories that would help desegregate the schools, not just in the South, but also in the North, that would use the vote to have a direct voice in Washington and to win economic rights all over the United States, not just in the South. Now, what good is biography here? We could recount this long civil rights movement without a purely biographical focus. We could look at a succession of kind of an alphabet soup of organizations, the NAACP, the SCLC, CORE, SNCC, et cetera. We could add to it perhaps the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which is A. Philip Randolph's union, add the Fellowship of Reconciliation, right? So we could tell the story organizationally, but I'd suggest here that biography could add a tremendous amount to it. And Bayard Rustin's biography is one that would allow us to do it. Rustin was involved with so many organizations of the classic phase of the civil rights movement, but he always had broader targets in mind. So in this list here, checkmark were organizations he was a member of. The double asterisks are organizations that he founded. The single asterisks are organizations that he was contributed dramatically to the founding. He was often nicknamed the founding uncle for the Fellowship of Reconciliation and for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was a member of SCLC, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, in 1964. Now, as a sign of the disputatiousness of the civil rights movement, Rustin actually disagreed sharply with many of them. The NAACP, which was the kind of banner carrier in the early stages, didn't have much faith in Rustin's call for Gandhian nonviolence. They considered it too passive and too weak. Rustin, in this case, would show them to be profoundly wrong. And to enter the period of politics, as he proposed in his famous essay after 1964, was by necessity entering a period of compromise. And so as the movement radicalized in 1965, and beyond, actually in along lines that he very much desired, there was perhaps mood for compromise among some of the groups. Rustin spent all of his life around these struggles, and in fact, many other struggles as well. A lifelong commitment to radical equality for workers, Black and white. He lived for a moment in the 1930s in the shadowy precincts of the far left, although he left the Communist Party very quickly when he concluded they were not really interested in rights for African Americans. They were just interested in challenging and using that to challenge the government. His commitment to economic inequality, and resolving it was visible through the 1960s when he joined the League for Industrial Democracy. He's involved in anti-war efforts. He's involved in union efforts. He sort of single-handedly covered a tremendous amount of ground for this long civil rights movement, and in fact did so over the entire period that we're looking at here, from the 40s until his death in 1987. If we're looking for one person to represent the long civil rights movement, and not just its classical phase, Rustin here seems to be a natural. He's a power presence on the front lines of activism. He taught nonviolence to Martin Luther King Jr. and to many, many others. He's the organizational genius behind the March on Washington in 1963. He helped bring into being so many organizations, some of which eventually split with him or disagreed or he fought with, but none of this dimmed his enthusiasm and his commitment. His steady belief in economic justice started long before Brown v. Board and continued all the way until his death. He offers a chance to see, offers a chance to see not just the heroism of this classical stage from 1954 to 65, but the broader aspirations for economic justice that preceded and followed that stage and were visible even on that stage if we know to go looking for them. Biography, again, isn't the only way to do this, but it is one of the most powerful and most accessible. Certainly the chance to watch a brief biographical documentary of Rustin, I think, helped us see the ways biography was a particularly useful tool in this regard. I want to turn then to mention some of the other questions that we'll be dealing with, will be dealing with in our seminar, and then I'm going to lump them into a broad question well posed in the closing number of Hamilton: who lives, who dies, who tells your story? I'll do everyone a favor here by not singing or even humming it, and stick to the words. But our seminar focuses on different ways that biographies are used for historical as political purposes, and help us think about how life stories offer not just insights into historical events, but histories all their own. We're going to start this, as we did last week, with a discussion of the WPA narratives of formerly enslaved people. Now, usually we don't associate the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, with slavery, and with good reason. It was an outfit that Roosevelt created in the 1930s, one of a number of agencies to try and inject money into the economy. The idea of the WPA was to employ people as a way for the government to spend its way out of the Great Depression. They built bridges and post offices all over the country. They built many of the most kind of imposing monumental buildings in Washington, D.C. But the WPA also employed white-collar workers, even creative types, in something called the Federal Writers Project, Theater Project, and so on. They ran theaters, photography programs. That's where Dorothea Lange, most of her famous photography, even travel guides. And they also set up a program in the southern states to interview those who had experienced slavery firsthand. From a historian's point of view, these efforts could earn our gratitude and admiration. And it's remarkable to have this direct access to individual recollections duly recorded from almost all of the slave states, including border states like Missouri and Kentucky that actually remained in the Union. They were asked questions about everyday life, about treatment under slavery, asked about the Civil War. They interviewed men and women from large plantations and small farms. It's kind of a remarkable project and thousands of interviews. It's also a remarkable project that now is actually fully digitized and available on the Library of Congress website. And yet, as we talked about in our seminar, and I'll warn you that there's a lot of and yets here, a little arithmetic suggests just one concern right at the outset. So someone who is alive in the Depression decade in their 70s or 80s would have been a child in slavery's last decade, possibly a teenager during the Civil War. Now, of course, there's not much to be done of that. By the time they get started in the 1930s, they're dealt with what they're dealt with. But there are other kind of concerns as well. Almost all of the interviewers were, the WPA, like so much of the rest of the New Deal, was fundamentally discriminatory. They deferred to state level partners or included specific caveats about local practices, which generally meant Jim Crow in the South. And indeed, there were a few cases of the thousands of interviews where descendants of the slave owners were actually interviewing the former slaves. It's a kind of a bizarre situation that we could say generously is unlikely to result in maximum candor. The interviews were not all recorded, but they were transcribed from notes. The questions weren't actually recorded as part of the interview, only the replies. And you can see in the sample here the very problematic rendering of dialect. For all of these and yets, all of these caveats we might have about it, I think they're in fact opportunities for us. They're teachable moments. They provide a chance to ask questions or to help students ask questions about the provenance, the promise, and the perils of whatever sources we're facing. How was this document produced? How did it end up in my hands? What residue was left, or how did the way in which the product, these documents were created, what evidence and traces did that leave in the documents themselves? These questions are very easy to see with a source like this, but I'd suggest the kinds of questions we want to ask, the interrogation of the sources that we want to undertake here, also apply in the same measure to all kinds of sources that students might take for granted. So it's a chance that this is not just a chance to think about and to read something about that's firsthand about slavery, even in problematic production, but a chance to engage in inquiry-based learning. Now, I won't dwell on this here, but shifting historical instruction from informational to inquisitive. Have students ask questions about a topic and then guided by teachers try to answer them. It focuses, I think, on the most important skills of how to be a historian. By helping students become their own historians, what was called in a very different era, actually in the 1930s, every man his own historian. The question of who gets to tell the story of former slaves, the answer could be that they got to tell the stories themselves. Or was it? I mean, here again, we're laying bare, this source lays bare some of the questions we should ask about all of the kinds of sources. I can't dwell on it here, but even something as one-sided as this interview process leaves traces of a struggle between interview and interviewee. And you can see this in the text of some of the interviews. These are hardly the only contested life stories. I want to wrap up here just very quickly, providing an overview, and for our seminar, a preview of the other ways biographies provide entree for thinking about teaching and thinking about U.S. history and thinking about teaching it, along the lines of Hamilton's question of who tells our stories. Who has the right, in some ways, to tell this story? Now, Paul Fussell, and thank God for the atom bomb, starts with this question, where he claims the authority not just to speak about soldiers' experiences, but he claims the unique authority to speak about the atomic bomb itself. But there are other controversies that we will deal with in here too. One involves a kind of frequently taught account called Black Elk Speaks. So same time that the WPA was in touch with formerly enslaved peoples, Nebraska's poet laureate, John Neihardt, visited the Pine Ridge Reservation to meet an Oglala holy man, Black Elk. Black Elk, in fact, had been present at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1880. Neihardt took extensive notes on frequent interviews about Oglala spirituality in particular. But whose narrative was this, right? Whose story was it? And here you can see subtly in just the difference between the two book covers, one that's more from the original on the left and one from the right, which has a different subtitle to it. Neihardt was so determined to find Native spirituality. And in fact, this book became really popular in the 1960s with a counterculture that was looking for alternative spirituality. And in fact, in Black Elk Speaks, Neihardt stresses what we might think of as the most exotic aspects of Native spirituality, and neglects to mention anywhere in the text, actually, that Black Elk had converted to Catholicism 2 decades before Neihardt's interview. So his role as a holy man was a sign of syncretism, of drawing on different traditions, not a sign of sort of direct access to Native Oglala spirituality as it existed in the 1930s. We'll also deal with 2 other kind of biographical controversies I'll just touch on for only a second here. Maxine Hahn Kingston was a pioneer in Asian American literature for what was sold as an autobiography called Woman Warrior in the 1970s, who was attacked not so long after by Frank Chin in the oddly named book, The Big IE, is attacked as a fake Asian American. Another case is actually brings us closer to questions of the long civil rights movement, is about Betty Friedan, the pioneer who started the second wave, as it's often called, of the women's rights movement in the 1960s with her book, The Feminine Mystique. A historian, Dan Horowitz, shown on the right here, uncovered Friedan's past as a union activist. Friedan had written in Feminine Mystique from the sort of subject position of a suburban housewife, college-educated suburban housewife. She says she got the idea for the book reading the survey of Smith alumni from 1947. 10 years later, all these people, she says, who were these sort of bright, curious, ambitious women ready to change the world, but 10 years later, are in her telling, are comparing notes about vac cleaners and diapers. Friedan, when she found out that Horowitz is writing this work, tried to sabotage his work, forbidding friends from speaking with her, and then ultimately rushing out her own autobiography, Life So Far, which refers disdainfully to others trying to tell her story. So she's trying to own her story. Now, of course, this talk, and indeed even the longer seminar, can deal only with a handful of American lives and select moments in American history, but hopefully can give you a sense of the power of biography as a tool for historical analysis and for teaching. So thanks very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, David. I have a first question. Where should kindergarten and first grade teachers start teaching the civil rights movement, and how can we make it age appropriate for them?
It's a tough question. One of the interesting things I found in one of the chapters from the book that we read for the organizational seminar was the one that showed up on here, Why Study History If It's Already on Your Phone, by Sam Weinberg. The last chapter is about heroes, and it says that American teenagers, when asked to identify heroes who are not celebrities or athletes, ranked Martin Luther King #1 and Rosa Parks #2. So clearly, we've done a good job. We nationally, educationally have done a good job about this. And I'm thrilled to see, as my kids were in the younger grades, what they were learning about civil rights movement. But there are ways of telling the story that don't require changing the focus, right? So I don't know that Bayard Rustin is what we should be doing in the lower grades. But we can focus on King. We can focus on King and what he's doing in these marches. We can look at the placards that were there, that were being used in 1963 or elsewhere, that are not just about ending segregation, but also about jobs and housing. Right? We can also teach, for instance, Rosa Parks, who's often taught and often taught as just a seamstress who was tired and did not want to move to the back of the bus. It's a good story, but in fact, Rosa Parks was an NAACP activist, was part of a very intentional plan to challenge the way the seating on the buses. And so we don't actually have to change especially at the lower grades, we don't actually have to change the pantheon of figures we're dealing with in order to offer a kind of more complete sense of their efforts. Right. And those two just little changes right there, right? Just sticking with King and Parks give us plenty of room, I think, even at the younger grades to talk about it, and actually to invite a conversation perhaps about how people present their own experiences. Why was it that, that the story came out this one way? What was in it for Parks in presenting it that way, when in fact, it's actually a more interesting, to my mind, more compelling story.
Thank you. This is from Ray Salazar. You and I have talked about this. The 1619 Project has angered some history professors for some historical inaccuracies. The main author of the project won a Pulitzer for the commentary, which should prove to critics it's an interpretation, a biography perhaps. What do you think of the contributions and criticism of the 1619 Project?
I guess I go a little bit to the line that anything worth stating is worth overstating. And so to say that it was a major contribution to public discussion, I think in some sense, it's actually shaped the kind of the movement of the last couple of months that moved very quickly from individual issue about police, a crucial issue about police killings, primarily of African Americans. But I think it deserves some of the credit for making that about structural inequality. And of course, Nicole Hannah-Jones was back recently writing about a case for reparations along these very lines. I do think, as historians always looking for more complexity, I do think some of the stuff is overstated. I don't think that the Constitution was written solely to defend slavery, although it's clear that it did, and that wasn't accidental, but it had other reasons as well. I think, but again, I think in terms of its contribution to a broader public debate, I think it was really eye-opening. And, weeks and weeks of letters to the editor about this confirmed that even kind of well-informed, thoughtful people who think of themselves as kind of right-minded on these issues were learning a tremendous amount from it.
Thanks. We have a request to explain de facto segregation.
So de facto segregation is segregation that is not by legislation or rule, but by practice. And so one of the big differences between segregated schools in the North and in the South was in the South, there were laws that said Black and white students will not be in school together. In the North, there were very few such laws that lasted into the 20th century. But of course, schooling in the United States is done by communities, right? By small towns, as well as by, and cities, not at a statewide level. And so what that means is that the population of students in your school reflects the racial composition in particular of the town. So that's, which is not legally segregating the schools. But then you add to this the complexities, both in the legal front, as well as some more insidious ways that Blacks who are otherwise, by finances qualified to move into a district or to get a mortgage were denied those. A process called redlining that the U.S. actually, at the federal level, contributed to when it was spending a lot of money guaranteeing mortgages in the Federal Housing Authority at the tail end of the New Deal or in the GI Bill. They said, for instance, that they would not guarantee any mortgage that changed the racial makeup of a town, right? So there's no law in most places in the North that says white and Black students can't be together. It's de jure segregation, there's segregation by law, nor is it accidental. And in fact, in this sense, this is why, as Rustin said, in 1964, that there were more schools, there was more school segregation in 64 than there was in 54. There never was a moment where schools were actually desegregated. Legal segregation came to an end. But the system we have now, which is highly segregated in most settings, is all essentially de facto segregation.
That is the last question from chat. If anybody else has questions, we can just field them out loud. Are there any further questions?
I just saw one from Brandon pop up in the chat.
Yes, biography is typically taught in the ELA classroom as informational text. How should ELA teachers frame instruction of historical biographies? Good question.
I think one can do it by focusing in a couple of ways, by focusing on narrative, right? Sorry, there's a truck passing by here. Hopefully not getting picked up on the mic too much. But if anyone wants some Coke, there's a whole 18-wheeler full of it just passing my house. The focus on how the narratives are constructed, right? And so I actually think, for instance, I just mentioned briefly feminine mystique, but the way the narrative is structured offers a lot for ELA teachers to think about how one tells the story as a piece of it. And then I think beyond that is some of the historical techniques I'm calling for, and so source interrogation, amount in some form or another to using elementary techniques of literary analysis, right? So I'm not saying that biographies, there are no facts and we should just treat everything as narrative, but we should treat it, we should be ready to interrogate any text we come across. And so the challenge in this sense isn't asking English teachers to do something different, it's asking ELA teachers to do more of what they're doing. And makes a sort of settings where you can combine ELA and social studies history instruction all the more valuable for dealing with something both as a narrative and as recounting a life experience.
Another question. Do you have any suggestions of civil rights activists who are lesser known who should be taught to elementary students?
There's a lot. I'd say one thing about the kind of standard narrative is it tends to be pretty male. So Ella Baker, who is one of the founders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, she was she's slightly older at the time, but really the instrumental figure behind that. She is a wonderful person to look. There's a great biography, award-winning biography of her. Bayard Rustin, I think, is terrific, although I didn't mention in here, and one of the reasons he stayed in the background a lot was that he was gay and he actually was arrested for homosexual activity in 1952 or 53. And that at all kinds of moments, people, including at the FBI, were threatening to kind of publicize this information about him. That's probably a part of the story that one could leave out in the elementary grades. But is interesting, but there are enough interesting elements of his involvement. I think Thurgood Marshall, he's sort of been canonized, of course, because he's appointed to the Supreme Court and has a long term as a justice on the court, but looking at the early legal efforts going back to the 1930s that set about trying to topple desegregation, legalize desegregation, by recognizing you're going to win small incremental legal victories that will build up until you've established a precedent that allows you to kind of break the dam open, which is what they did in a set of law cases early on. Brown v. Board, again, is culmination of a legal strategy, not the beginning of one. So those are a few names. There are plenty of others. It's an enterprise that didn't lack for heroes and activists.
So if there are no further questions, Jim, Stephanie, should we conclude? Everybody have a good morning.
Bye, Krista. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for a great lecture, David.
Thank
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.